A peer-reviewed study is getting renewed attention this week, and its core finding is genuinely striking. Stress on two of Southern California's most dangerous fault systems, the San Andreas and the San Jacinto, has reached its highest level in 1,000 years. The study's lead author describes the system as being in a critically loaded state. And there's a specific structural feature, a junction called Cajon Pass, that scientists say could determine whether the next major earthquake here stays contained to one fault or spreads across both and becomes something dramatically larger. So today I want to walk you through exactly what this study actually found, why Cajon Pass matters so much, and what scientists are genuinely watching for as this research continues to develop. Make sure you're subscribed before we get into it, because this is real, current science getting fresh attention, not a breaking event. Let's start with the research itself. The study was published this summer in the Journal of Geophysical Research. Solid Earth, led by Lillian Burkhardt, a geophysicist who conducted much of the work at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and is now at the University of Bern in Switzerland. Using computer simulations modeling roughly 1,000 years of rupture history across the region, the research team estimated how stress has built up along critical segments of the San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems over time, and how that accumulated stress affects the surrounding area. The findings were direct. Stress levels on multiple fault segments are now at or above the highest values recorded across the past millennium. Burkhardt put it plainly. Our results show that stress levels on multiple fault segments are now at or above the highest values seen in the past millennium, and that the region may be capable of a large, through-going rupture involving both fault systems. The study attributes part of this buildup to simple time. Roughly 160 years have passed since the last major rupture along this specific stretch of the fault system, and stress that would normally be released periodically through large earthquakes has instead continued accumulating. Here's the part of this research that I think is genuinely the most scientifically interesting, and it's easy to miss if you only catch the record stress headline. The San Andreas and San Jacinto faults meet at a specific location called Cajon Pass, a mountain pass in Southern California that carries major highway and rail infrastructure between the Los Angeles basin and the high desert. Researchers found that this junction functions as what they're calling an earthquake gate, a critical structural point that can determine whether a future rupture stays confined to a single fault or jumps across the junction and spreads into a connected, much larger event involving both fault systems at once. That gate can work in either direction. Sometimes, historically, it has stopped a rupture at Cajon Pass, containing the earthquake to one fault system. Other times, it has facilitated a joint rupture, allowing an earthquake to spread from one fault to the other. What determines which outcome happens isn't simply whether stress is high, it's the specific balance of stress across that junction. Nick Weingarten, whose research group models earthquake stress and triggering on the San Andreas Fault, explained the real insight of this study clearly. The insight isn't that stress builds over time, which we've long known, but that the balance of stress across the junction may decide whether the next earthquake stays contained or grows into a much bigger rupture. The specific numbers here are worth knowing. Past simulations showed ruptures traveled through Cajon Pass when the stress difference between the two fault segments was as small as 3 megapascals. The current measured gap, according to Burkhardt's research, is 8 megapascals, nearly 3 times that historical threshold. That's the specific data point driving this study's elevated concern. Not just that stress is high in some general sense, but that the specific stress imbalance across this particular junction now sits well past the level that's historically been associated with a rupture, jumping between the two fault systems. It's worth understanding what this kind of stress modeling actually involves, since stress in this context isn't a simple, single number the way an earthquake's magnitude is. Researchers use a calculation called Coulomb stress transfer to estimate how the accumulated strain from tectonic plate motion, combined with the effects of past earthquakes in the region, distributes itself across a network of connected faults. Rather than treating each fault segment as an isolated system, this kind of modeling accounts for how a rupture on one segment physically deforms the surrounding crust, potentially loading or unloading stress on neighboring segments as a result, which is exactly the mechanism that determines whether the gate at a junction like Cajon Pass stays closed or opens during a given earthquake. Building a 1,000-year simulation of that kind of interaction requires combining paleoseismic data, physical evidence of past earthquakes preserved in soil and rock layers, with physics-based models of how stress has likely built and released across the fault network over that entire period, since direct instrumental seismic records only extend back a little over a century. That's part of why this kind of study represents such a significant undertaking. It's not simply measuring today's conditions, it's reconstructing a millennium of stress history to understand how today's specific numbers compare to the full range of conditions this fault system has experienced. It's worth understanding what scientists mean when they describe a joint rupture as being categorically more dangerous than a single fault earthquake, since the difference isn't just a matter of degree. Burkhardt was specific about the scale. In terms of severity, a joint rupture crossing Cajon Pass could approach around a magnitude 7, 4 to 7, 8, and affect a far larger area than a single fault event. The reason a combined rupture reaches that much higher magnitude comes down to basic earthquake physics. Magnitude scales with the total length and area of fault that actually slips during an event. So a rupture that crosses from the San Andreas onto the San Jacinto, or vice versa, releases dramatically more energy than a rupture confined to either fault individually, even though both faults are capable of serious earthquakes entirely on their own. To put that magnitude jump in perspective, it helps to remember that the earthquake magnitude scale is logarithmic, not linear. Each whole number increase represents roughly 32 times more energy released, not simply a proportionally bigger shake. A magnitude 6. 8 earthquake confined to one fault segment, and a magnitude 7. 6 joint rupture, spanning both the San Andreas and San Jacinto, aren't just somewhat bigger versions of each other. The joint rupture would release dramatically more total energy over a much longer rupture length and produce strong shaking across a correspondingly larger geographic footprint. That's the core reason researchers treat the Cajon Pass gate as such a consequential detail. It's not simply a question of whether Southern California experiences a significant earthquake at some point, which is treated as effectively inevitable, given the region's tectonics, but whether that earthquake stays contained to a scale the region's infrastructure and emergency response systems are built to handle, or crosses into a substantially larger, more complex event. The geographic reach of that kind of event would be substantial. According to the study, an earthquake simultaneously striking both fault lines would be significantly more damaging and would affect heavily populated areas including Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside, and the Coachella Valley, a stretch of Southern California home to millions of people, along with critical highway, rail, and energy infrastructure that runs directly through or near the Cajon Pass corridor itself. This isn't a purely theoretical scenario researchers invented from scratch. There's a specific historical event they believe demonstrates this exact mechanism already happened once before. In 1812, a magnitude 7, 5 earthquake known as the Wrightwood earthquake struck the region, and researchers suspect it actually crossed Cajon Pass, rippling along both the San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems in a single event. That 1812 earthquake caused 40 deaths, significant for the far smaller population of the region at the time, and a genuinely sobering reference point for what a similar joint rupture could mean for a region now home to millions more people and vastly more infrastructure than existed 2 centuries ago. It's worth understanding why researchers can even make a claim like this about an earthquake from more than 2 centuries ago, since 1812 obviously predates any modern seismic instrumentation. Evidence for events like the Wrightwood earthquake comes primarily from paleoseismology, the study of physical evidence for ancient earthquakes preserved in the geological record, including offset stream channels, disturbed soil layers, and other ground deformation that can be dated and matched against historical written accounts from the period. Spanish mission records and other contemporary accounts from early 19th century California provide some corroborating detail on the shaking and damage from 1812, and researchers cross-reference that historical documentation against the physical geological evidence preserved along the fault traces themselves to reconstruct both the likely magnitude and the probable rupture path of an earthquake that happened well before anyone was recording it with instruments. That combination of historical record and physical fault evidence is what allows scientists to treat the Wrightwood earthquake as genuine. If imperfect, real-world evidence that a Cajon Pass joint rupture isn't just a computer model's hypothetical output, it's something this specific junction has plausibly done before. One detail from the renewed coverage of this study deserves particular attention because it's the kind of secondary consequence that's easy to overlook next to the immediate shaking and structural damage a major earthquake produces. Dr. Lucy Jones, one of the seismologists featured in recent coverage of this research, pointed out a specific vulnerability. Aqueducts actually cross the San Andreas Fault, and if something happens, you might not have water for a while. According to researchers at UCLA, the Los Angeles Aqueduct, the Colorado River Aqueduct, and the State Water Project all physically cross fault lines at multiple points along their routes. Southern California depends heavily on imported water delivered through exactly these systems, given how much of the region's population and agriculture exceeds what local water sources alone could support. A major rupture severing or damaging these aqueducts at multiple crossing points wouldn't just be a structural or transportation crisis. It could mean extended water service disruption for a region of millions of people, layered on top of every other consequence of the earthquake itself. In recent coverage of this research, Dr. Jones drew a specific comparison to help illustrate how this kind of rupture spreading mechanism actually plays out, pointing to the earthquake that struck Venezuela in June 2026. It's the same type of what's called a transform fault, she said. It began west of Caracas and then ruptured towards Caracas, therefore helping focus energy into the heavily populated areas. A transform fault is one where two tectonic plates slide horizontally past each other, the same basic category as the San Andreas system itself. And Jones's point was that the Venezuela earthquake demonstrated in real time and in an actual populated region exactly the kind of directional rupture propagation that concerns researchers about a potential Cajon Pass scenario. An earthquake that doesn't just release energy in place, but actively ruptures toward a population center, concentrating its destructive energy exactly where the most people and infrastructure are located. I want to be precise about what this study does and doesn't claim, because it matters enormously for how seriously to take it without overstating it. This research is not a prediction that an earthquake will strike Cajon Pass on any particular timeline. It's a stress and hazard assessment, a rigorous, peer-reviewed modeling effort that identifies current conditions as unusually favorable for the kind of joint rupture the region hasn't experienced in the modern, densely populated era. Earthquake science, even at its most sophisticated, cannot currently specify exactly when a fault under elevated stress will actually rupture. What a study like this one can do is identify that the underlying physical conditions, the accumulated stress, the specific imbalance across the Cajon Pass junction, now closely resemble the conditions that have historically preceded major joint ruptures, based on both the computer modeling and the 1812 precedent. Burkhardt herself was direct about the message she wants people to take from this. The underlying message of the new research is not to panic, but act with urgency. That's a genuinely important distinction. This isn't a call for alarm about an imminent specific event. It's a call for the kind of serious, evidence-based preparation that a legitimate, elevated hazard assessment warrants, treating the possibility as a realistic planning scenario rather than either a certainty or a remote, dismissible worst case. That act with urgency framing has practical implications beyond individual household preparedness. The researchers behind this study have specifically recommended that city managers and emergency responders plan for joint ruptures along the San Andreas and San Jacinto faults as a realistic possibility given current stress conditions, not as a remote worst-case scenario to be considered only in the abstract. That's a meaningful shift in how this specific hazard is being treated by the people responsible for regional emergency planning, moving a joint rupture scenario from a theoretical extreme to an actual near-term planning assumption, given what the stress data currently shows. It's worth understanding where Cajon Pass sits within the broader network of faults across southern and northern California, since the San Andreas system is genuinely a network of interconnected fault branches, rather than a single continuous line. Further north, in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Calaveras Fault is itself a major branch of the San Andreas system, believed to link with both the Hayward Fault and the West Napa Fault near the Carquinez Strait, a different regional cluster of interconnected faults with its own history of moderate and large earthquakes, including the magnitude 6. 2 Morgan Hill earthquake in 1984 and a magnitude 5. 6 event near Alum Rock in 2007. That's a useful reminder that the earthquake gate concept driving concern about Cajon Pass isn't a totally isolated phenomenon. The San Andreas system as a whole is built from multiple branching, interconnected fault segments, several of which have their own documented history of complex, multi-segment rupture behavior. Separately, there's the broader context of what a full San Andreas rupture could mean at the largest possible scale, based on earlier catastrophic modeling. A widely cited risk analysis previously estimated that a theoretical magnitude 8 earthquake along the San Andreas Fault, which spans roughly 800 miles from Los Angeles County to the Bay Area, could damage an estimated 5 million California homes. An even more extreme, though considered unlikely, scenario involving simultaneous rupture of the fault's northern and southern sections was estimated to cause nearly $300 billion in damages. That larger scale modeling is a different scenario from the specific Cajon Pass joint rupture concern this new study focuses on, but it's useful context for understanding the outer bounds of what this fault system is understood to be capable of, even as the current research specifically narrows in on the more immediate, better supported Cajon Pass mechanism. If you live in Southern California, particularly anywhere in the Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, Riverside, or the Coachella Valley, this research is a legitimate reason to make sure your own earthquake preparedness is genuinely current, not because a rupture is imminent on any specific timeline, but because the researchers behind this exact study have explicitly said current conditions warrant treating this as a realistic near-term scenario. That means having a household emergency plan, knowing how you'd communicate with family if phone networks became overloaded, and having basic supplies, water, food, medications, sufficient to last several days without relying on normal infrastructure. A few specifics worth having settled ahead of time rather than figured out in the moment. Know your home's specific earthquake risks, including whether it's been retrofitted for seismic safety if it's an older structure, since unreinforced buildings consistently fare worse in strong shaking regardless of which fault ultimately produces it. Secure heavy furniture, water heaters, and anything mounted on walls that could fall during strong shaking. Identify the safest spot in each room you spend significant time in, generally under sturdy furniture, away from windows and anything that could topple, since the standard drop, cover, and hold-on guidance remains the right response regardless of which specific fault segment or combination of segments eventually ruptures. And if you drive through Cajon Pass regularly, whether for work or travel between the Los Angeles basin and the high desert, it's worth having a general sense of alternate routes, given how directly that corridor sits inside the specific junction this research is focused on. Given the specific water infrastructure vulnerability this research highlights, it's worth taking Dr. Jones's warning seriously in a very literal sense. Consider keeping a larger stored water reserve than you might otherwise, specifically because a major rupture along this fault system could disrupt the aqueduct systems Southern California depends on for a meaningful stretch of time, not just the more commonly discussed structural and transportation impacts. If you live or work near Cajon Pass specifically, or regularly use the highway and rail routes that pass through it, it's worth having an alternate route in mind in case that corridor becomes impassable following a significant earthquake. Beyond individual preparedness, this is also a reasonable moment to support and pay attention to how local emergency management agencies are responding to this research. Since the study's authors have specifically called for city-level planning to treat a joint rupture as a realistic scenario, public infrastructure decisions, retrofitting, aqueduct redundancy, transportation corridor planning are exactly the kind of response this research is intended to inform. And it's worth being an informed resident when those conversations happen at the local level. I'll keep tracking how this research develops, including whether follow-up studies refine the stress estimates at Cajon Pass further, and whether emergency planning agencies across Southern California begin visibly incorporating this joint rupture scenario into their public guidance. I want to be clear one more time about what this story is and isn't. It's a serious, peer-reviewed scientific finding about elevated stress and a specific structural vulnerability in one of the most consequential fault systems in the country, not a prediction of an imminent earthquake. That distinction is exactly why the researchers themselves are framing this as a call for urgency and preparation, not panic. As it says in Psalm 46, God is our refuge and strength, and ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. Research like this exists to help us prepare wisely, not to induce fear about something outside our control. If you're in the region this study covers, let it be a genuine, practical nudge toward better preparedness, and I'll keep bringing you the real science as this research continues to develop. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.